doesn't ask that question quickly, I will, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. Most importantly, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I acknowledge their custodianship of this land and their leaders, past, present, and emerging. We're now all loaded and set to go? Okay. So, fabulous speakers today, and we have Danian Singh, as I mentioned, coming to us from Fiji. Then we have Professor John McCarthy and Charina Chazali, coming all the way from Jakarta, yes, and Ellie Wong, coming to us all the way from Melbourne. Oh, exactly what we need in the moments of crisis. So thanks very much, Ellie. So if we can load Ellie's talk. Ellie's from World Vision, and she leads their economic empowerment team, overseeing a global portfolio of inclusive market systems, development, financial inclusion, and women's economic empowerment. And here we go. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Robyn. So yeah, I'm really pleased to present today the last sort of 6-7 years of learning on women's economic empowerment programs in Bangladesh. And I'm going to be looking at 2 key programs. How do we... It's not moving. This way. I think that the tech's loving us on this panel. We're looking at 2 Australian NGO cooperation program projects that are adopted the similar approach to women's economic empowerment, but made 2 different adaptations for the northwest in Jamalpur and down in Cox's Bazar with host communities. So the first project was the Nutrition Sensitive Value Chains for Smallholder Farmers project, reaching 20,000 households through the Inclusive Market Systems Development Approach, or IMSD. And the other program, the Gender Inclusive Pathways of Poverty program, was reaching kind of a lot less, 2,800, but the ultra poor, so the very vulnerable households in Teknaf and Ukiah, just outside the camps. And this project looked at ultra poor graduation as well as transition market systems types of activities. We had about 60% of project participants who were women in the first program, and the Ultra Pro Graduation program had all participants primarily that were women. So in terms of what the common challenges were in Bangladesh, I think we heard this morning that we're really far behind when it comes to gender equality progress in relation to the SDGs, like we're 134 years away. But there are the common challenges for women in agriculture linked to access, agency, and the broader enabling environment are quite similar in the 2 contexts. So women make up more than half the agricultural workforce in Bangladesh, but are undervalued and underpaid. When we're thinking about issues around food security and nutrition, women and girls are eating less and less, and in particular, more vulnerable to climate shocks. That was definitely the case for female-headed households in Cox's Bazar. When we're thinking about agency, women are facing constrained decision-making linked to income, nutrition, but also issues of child marriage and child labour. And again, that was really prominent in the poorer households in Cox's Bazar. So at the start of these programs in the Jamalpur context, so the women told us, usually my husband decides. He is a guardian. I have no rights to ignore his decision. And across Bangladesh, I guess mother-in-laws are reinforcing these intra-household gender dynamics. And in the context of Cox's Bazar, sort of seeing women in female-headed households deferring to father-in-laws and sons, the kind of key decision-making elements there. So I suppose the underlying root cause here does link to the social norm issue, which many colleagues have mentioned during today. In Jamalpur, women are playing really important roles, especially in post-harvest processing, but are kind of seen as helpers, and even kind of very attitudes like if women go to agricultural land, crop production will be less. We heard in those communities in Jamalpur and in the Cox's Bazar context, probably even more conservative perspectives around women's mobility were it's not decent for women to be outside the house. People will look at them with bad intentions and they will bring dishonour to their families. So what was our sort of common approach when we're thinking about these different challenges that women are facing in agriculture? I think the main element is to think about the gender inclusive business models and focus on women's incomes and access to economic opportunities. But we can't ignore the other challenges that women are facing in relation to agency and underlying social norms. And we do really need intentional programming to address this. So firstly, we've been looking at improving women's income in Jamalpur in mixed and male-led crops, so maize, rice, which is very well more investment, as well as chili and vegetable. Whereas in Cox's Bazar, we were focusing on where women were working already in this more conservative context in livestock. And the key strategy was to support women to take up more vulnerable roles in agriculture, including the marketing and sales as entrepreneurs, and to partner with key agribusiness and other market actors on new products, services, and opportunities. But there was another really important component when we're thinking about World Vision's approach to inclusive market systems development and women's economic empowerment was to, work at the household level as well to help households better engage and benefit from agricultural markets. So that's things like business training, financial management training, financial capability, helping with collective buying and selling and organising in groups, and for poorer, the ultra poor, looking at coaching and assets and basic needs support at the start of the program. The other important piece was adding a gender transformative programming layer that sought to make women's work in agriculture really visible and to value not just this work, but their unpaid work, their care work. So I think in terms of nutrition, when we were thinking about nutrition-sensitive agriculture, we were more focused on the women's empowerment and the income pathways. So we looked at targeted nutrition behaviour change so that it was really around looking at the purchasing of nutritious food, not necessarily the growing of nutritious food primarily on the commercial side, but that we did home gardens for dietary diversity to complement the nutrition behaviour change. So what did it look like in Jamalpur? So the key challenge here linked to low productivity and low incomes was lack of access to quality agri-inputs. So the business model was centred around improved agri-inputs, particularly hybrid and high-yielding seeds. The project established 800 producer groups to incentivise companies like Petrochem, Bioseeds and Malik Seeds to come to the remote part of Jamalpur for the first time. We supported a new distribution channel through community sales agents to help companies expand their outreach. We also looked at opportunities for women's entrepreneurship in terms of business and service provision for the producer groups that we helped establish. So things like threshing, seedling production, and those kinds of activities where we already know there was demand there. So there was definitely challenges at the start of the program. I think I put a quote up there from one of the companies that we worked with that we weren't habituated to deal with women producers and entrepreneurs at our outlets and business centres. But, with the program's, repeat interactions, that a business case was able to be established and women were able to be valued more over time as clients and customers. On the other hand, in the Cox's Bazar project, the key challenge in the native chicken value chain was disease and lack of access to vaccinations. So the business model here was centred around improved vaccination and availability of chicks. It's actually interesting, the tourism sector was driving the demand there as well as the humanitarian response. And the business opportunities were looking at women playing roles as vaccinators and managing hatcheries. And I think in this particular context, as I mentioned, it's more conservative. And so the project established 8 women-friendly marketplaces where women could feel safe and to sell their products, and as well as childcare corners where they could bring their children, which was really important, particularly for female-headed households. So I think obviously we hear a lot about women's decision-making and control over income, and we know it's really important. And I suppose in the design, we really wanted a practical and operational approach to address this. So we partnered with Equimundo, who had done a lot of work in this space on engaging men and boys with a lot of success, particularly in the health sector, but looking at partnering with them for adapting their approach for economic development and agri-food systems. So the training, the gender training, is for couples, and they're trained over several months on gender issues like gender and power, decision-making, how to manage work and parenting, and gender-based violence. And I think the key issue here is that we're not telling women, men, or husbands and wives what to think about gender, but to question attitudes over time via sort of dialogue, debate, reflection, and to kind of posit an alternative way of thinking about it. For example, one of the exercises is around man box, woman box, human box, and they ask what it means to act like a man or a woman in your community, and what it means to act like a man or a woman in your community, why these belief systems exist, and what might be the benefits of a human box or thinking about gendered roles differently. So in terms of this approach, it's very resource intensive. So for 20,000 households, we couldn't scale that across the entire program. So we sought to put the most effective sessions and sort of piggyback them on our financial literacy training and really focus on entry points to women's control over income where it matters. So household budgets where decisions are made about nutrition, household budgets where decisions are made about the benefit of income and the flow on to children. There was a lot of backbiting at the start of the program. So gossiping or about the women entrepreneurs, about the men who were supporting their wives in this space. And we initially tackled that with courtyard sessions, bringing in mother-in-laws who were supportive, bringing in male role models. At the midterm of the program, however, we weren't sort of seeing the success we needed on the social norm front. So we tried to switch it up and train religious leaders using the similar methodology so that they could become more champions of gender equality in the community to role model the types of changes that we wanted to see. And in particular, looked at working with them to adapt the sessions linked to religious text. So in terms of how we went on different women's economic empowerment domains, we had income from target crops increase, but nearly triple, from $97 to $300 by the end of the program. Women with their own regular income increased from 26% to 66%. We had success with farmers feeling more confident in their capacity to deal with climate change. And we had increased success with male engagement with the care work, with men spending 1.5 hours a day more and women spending an hour a day less. However, the decision-making on indicator didn't move as much as we would, didn't move positively as expected. And there was mixed data on that. We did see positive changes on the social norm front. So people in agreement with the attitude that it's okay for a man to beat their wife was sort of people, about half agreed at the start of the program, and this reduced to about 20% by the end. And in terms of the percentage of children 6 to 23 months receiving minimum dietary diversity in the last 24 hours, that increased a lot from 12 to 75%. So the project was $5.8 million, we were able to leverage 6.8 from the private sector and from producer groups. So how did we go on the Cox's Bazar program? We had a similar success on the income side. So almost tripling from 56 to 161, but you can see the difference there. It's a really different poverty category. Households utilizing financial services increased. And this project, we had a lot better success on the decision-making in family-run enterprises, increasing from 11 to 78%, and women reporting satisfaction with time use increasing from about 30 to 89, as well as positive movements on attitudes towards gender equality, sort of similar indicator, 45 to 70, and improvements in food security. So it's a different, as I said, a different poverty category, but we still were able to have about $1 million collectively earned from the producer groups by the end of the program. So the key learnings, yeah, it's exciting to actually have stayed with the programs through design to implementation. I think it was great to see that our hypothesis around, focusing on gender inclusive business models for women's income and access, and layering gender transformative programming with evidence working, at that nutrition layering also working. I think, we know that social norms drive behaviour of market actors and therefore outcomes for women and men in agri-food systems. So we really do need to pay attention to this part of the work, as well as the kind of core work in improving incomes and access. There were definitely clear trade-offs between the scale of the program and the sort of market systems work and the kind of depth of impact. You see that there was better results on the agency side in the program when we worked with less households. And in the Jamalpur program, we're working in mixed crops and male-led crops, maize, rice, as well as mixed chili and leafy green, whereas in Cox's Bazar, we were working in livestock where women were already accepted. The men care model adapted for the context was moderately effective, engaging men in the care work. But it's actually the gender inclusive financial literacy training program that's been a lot more popular in terms of replication in other parts of Bangladesh and in other countries that World Vision works in, because as I mentioned, it does enable us to practically layer key messages around the importance of women's voices in household budgets with, training on financial management training. And women, we actually ask women and men to do their household vision separately and then compare before helping them prepare their budgets. And it's not always the same. I did the same with my husband. And I think it often unveils different differences. In terms of challenges and way forward, climate change was a big issue, threatening progress in the program, particularly flooding. And so future programming would need to scope more gender and climate responsive business models. We made progress on the sort of male engagement in the care work, but that's not enough. I think we need to do more in looking at care economy interventions in rural and informal settings. So social norms in slow-moving variables in agri-food system, takes a long time. And I suppose we were absorbing good programming from the NGO community development space where we directly implemented that men care model. But I think future interventions, we should be promoting co-creation with, the religious actors or other private or public actors with incentives to continue and think about creative ways to layer those types of messages so that it can be practically and sustainably connected into the future. So, yeah, thanks everybody for your time.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ellie. No, well, come across. I'm going to ask you a question while John gets set up. It's time. It does take time for things to change. I note that in Australia, it took until 1994 for women to be able to list farming as a profession. So Absolutely. Yes. So whenever you look for interesting examples, always good to start at home. Anyway, is there a quick question or shall I go to my quick question? Yes. No, I bow to you, Dave, please.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think we partnered with in Jamalpur with the different companies that I mentioned. I think the you know the idea is that we piloted things, not in a big scale at first, to make sure that the companies were profiting from their business model. So they are increasing their sales of the agri inputs. And so we can see indications of sustainability. We're still working, this project got extended to a phase 2, and we're trying to evolve the private sector partnerships and formalize it through different agreements, as well as scope how the contracting agreements can exist in the future with the farming groups. But yeah, I mean, I think those are the kind of signals around sustainability. Like, are they making profit? And originally the first company was Petrochem, and then we started to work with other companies as well. That's the other indicator. But yeah, did I answer your question? Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, now we have a duet, is it? Yeah, so thanks, John. I'll let you introduce yourself, and Charina, please also introduce yourselves, and we'll let you talk as long as we can.
Hi, sir.
Right. I'm John McCarthy from the Crawford School, and this is Charina from the director of Akatiga. So we're very lucky to have Charina flying all the way down here today. So what we're presenting here is very much a group piece of work, and we're very thankful also to Connexi for supporting this. You can see most of the colleagues in the project. There's a few other people that I could add, but it gets a little bit like Ben-Hur. Hope you're all awake this time of the day. So today I'm presenting on behalf of Pak Prudence, who's really coordinating the forest part of the work, Ibu Wong, who's also doing the social forestry aspect, and Charina is doing the social reproduction side, and she's going to present that part of it. So you can see behind in the photo, Gunung Lewo Tobi, which has erupted just the last 3 weeks, sadly. But at the time we were there, it was very beautiful and calm. And it's a 1,600-meter high volcano that looked really wonderful, but we didn't suspect it was about to erupt. So this is very much a work in progress. So we're still waiting for many of the results to come through. So just to begin, as we've seen from the last 2 presentations, smallholder farmers in the global south are highly vulnerable to climate change. And one of the things that really strikes one about Eastern Indonesia is that many farmers are dependent on mixed hill farming food systems. And so nowadays there's this kind of approach to thinking about agroecology or agroforestry or Indonesian context, social forestry as a way to deal with their climate-related vulnerability. And this is very much what we're focusing on in these landscapes. Okay, so when we started developing the project with Bappenas, which is a national planning agency in Indonesia, they were very much interested in understanding the strategies and pathways that the communities are using to adapt, because it's not really apparent to them. So this kind of diagram that you can see on the right here is really a pictorial representation of how these kind of livelihood pathways are being imagined in the literature. And this really shaped a lot of our thinking. The other thing that shaped our thinking was Bappenas are really interested in the Nexus approach, which is really about trying to think about the interconnections and the complex interdependencies between food, agriculture, and climate. And this, you can see this represented in a CGIAR document in the diagram here, which I'm not going to dwell on. But the idea is that by looking at these approaches, we can think about the room to maneuver that communities have and the possibilities for solutions. And we can also think about the Nexus idea as an opportunity to rethink these complex linkages and interdependencies and find new ways of helping communities. So the question here that Papanas was interested in was trying to think about how an integrated approach might work. The other thing that really strikes one about the climate change literature is this, I was talking about this earlier today, the disruption in the way knowledge is understood and validated. And we see that this at all levels. But this problem really provokes this co-production or co-creation question. How can we leverage community insights and priorities? And how can we build upon existing pathways in the community? And this is also part of the black box that people at the top of the state don't really understand. They can see people are incredibly versatile and adaptive, but they don't really understand in great depth how it actually works. So you can see this part of our co-production process here in this photo. You can see Julius and Ibu Wong engaging local communities in a process of trying to identify their adaptive strategies and how they see possible ways forward. So if we move to Nusa Tenggara, which are the islands just above Australia, just next to East Timor, which is where we're doing our work, we're focused in Flores, the island on the top of these maps. You can see that, and when we think about climate change, these islands are really the canary in the coal mine. So if we think about the external, when people think about climate change vulnerability, they think about the external aspects, the exposure, and also the sensitivity to climate change. So when we think about the external aspects, we see these changing rainfall patterns. I won't dwell on this, we're all aware of it, but we also see that this part of Indonesia had, even before climate change, according to historical records, 36% less rainfall than Western Indonesia. So it was already exposed. And what we're seeing is the wet season being compacted and a great deal of rainfall falling usually in just 2 months. And this leading to low organic content in the soil. And in terms of the external aspects of the communities or the landscape, we see a complex set of problems around social relations, the way trading networks and value chains, which is something that ASEA spent a great deal of time working on. We also see problems of state capacity and a history of failing outside interventions. So this is the internal aspects in the communities. So now we'll move on to thinking about the pathways through which communities are kind of adjusting. So this might look like a forest, but it's actually a community garden. And what we see is the first primary adaptive strategy of communities is a whole set of micro strategies, all to do with dealing with all kinds of events in these landscapes. And it's a very long list. But the main strategies that they're doing is intensifying their agroforest production systems. So what they're doing is they're replanting what used to be used for seasonal rice with drought-tolerant tree crops. And this is particularly a great adaptive strategy with people with more than 3 hectares of land, because what they can do is substitute their rice growing systems for their tree growing systems, which are much more adaptive and much more able to cope. And through growing tree crops, they can sell the products and buy food in the market. But the problem is for people less than 3 hectares of land, this is a problematic strategy because they can't produce enough cash crops. And what we found in the 2 sites we were doing is that in one site, 55%, and the other site, about 70% of people were below the 3 hectare threshold. So what we see then is a kind of differentiation in the community between those who can pursue these strategies and those that are kind of left out of them. So when we move on to, so those with below 3 hectares tend to have less capacity to buy food in the market. And then when the dry season comes, they're left with a carbohydrate-rich diet with very little access to protein. So it's in these very same landscapes that the the Indonesian government is rolling out a social forestry programs, and these are very much a window of opportunity for rethinking how the state might support these communities. So most of these areas, the green areas are the areas zoned as forest areas, and the areas inside them are the social forestry areas. The problem is that these programs, although they have extensive areas under community agroforests, they don't really speak to the local community and production systems. So the question is how to help with the agroforestry production in these areas that are zoned for forestry. And the main problem is that people are just planting trees without, there's no kind of agricultural extension system. So people plant trees by guesswork. They don't really know what to plant. So they're trialing all sorts of different trees. And the forestry department comes along with, you know, boxes of little seedlings of various sorts of crops without any, I think if you go to Bunnings, you get more advice on what you should plant. I don't mean to be disparaging, but it's very challenging for local communities. That's a quote from a local community leader. He said, from a priest, actually, a Catholic priest who used to live here in Australia. And we were talking about it. He said, in Australia, you get more advice from Bunnings. So what we see is this question of whether the social forestry program can actually be put to use to actually support community resilience and address the climate precarity, which is a good, one more slide and I'll pass on to Ibu Charina. So the other aspect of the self-initiated strategies in the communities are around how they deal with seasonality. So what we see is during the period around the harvest and after the wet season, they often have several commodities that they can sell. But as the season gets tougher and tougher, they're left with usually one commodity. And depending on the season, different tree crops can fail. And so what we found in one focus group discussion, one of the community leaders said, well, we get about 50% of the rice production we used to get 10 years ago, which was a pretty shocking statistic. I mean, we haven't got production statistics to prove this, but this was his conclusion. So what we see is communities who are unable to sell several commodities because their production is very low or their tree crops have failed are particularly susceptible. At the same time as their rice production is falling, their access to protein is dependent on their access to cash. We see patterns of deeper insecurity in the dry season. And particularly in the end of the dry season and then in the wet season, which is a very violent wet season in Flores. At the same time, we see a nutritional shift, which our last two speakers talked about, towards a less diverse food system and a very much a dependence on markets. Okay, so now I'll turn over to you. One thing I forgot to say, however, is I have all these food strategies around dealing with the dry season, but it's largely around substituting proteins for carbohydrate.
Thank you. This is for the pathways number 3, self-initiated strategies, option to diversify income sources. This pathway emphasizes the significant financial squeeze due to rising expenditure, explore various strategies for income diversification. These strategies include 1, the migration. Migration, of course, could provide better employment, better income, but we found that migration also comes with challenges and risk. A lot of respondents often get the salary from migration only for the daily life, and then very often can send the remittance to the small amount to the village, and mostly the husband, the son working in oil palm plantation. And the second one is cycles of debt. A lot of 63% of households have debt. Corporation, Mekar, and bank. Actually, Mekar is state-owned enterprises. If we see from the website, the interest rate only 7 to 10 actually, but in the reality, the Mekar is a microfinance program specifically targeted to women. The woman conducted the weekly payment loan without collateral, of course, and the real interest in the field could be as high 45% for 50 weeks of payment. And the third, new enterprises, a lot of households starting a new small business or exploring non-agricultural income as alternative for financial stability. What John mentioned and the last slide, exploring the precarity refers to the insecure existence, highlights how social, labor, gender inequalities limit people's ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. This intersectionality and or cross-cutting, you can mention it, raising the question who is the precarious one or who is the most affected by these inequalities. And from precarious, the study also highlighting the various pressure faced in the social reproduction, emphasizing the burden of overlapping responsibility faced by women. You can see that crop failures, male migration, cycles of debt, and limited access to farming inputs. Care work such as nurturing children and food preparation, usually often undervalued yet actually critical for household survival. And this accumulation of responsibility, making them having little time or no time to rest, personal development, or income diversification. In addition, cultural obligation like customary financial demands, education fee, just going at more pressure to this rural woman. This is just a small quote from one of our respondents that near landless woman, 30 years old, still young, lives with her 2 children and grandmother, while the husband has migrated for years to Kalimantan. This is emphasized the burdens faced by women to struggle manage the household responsibility, nurturing, and also dealing with the limited access resources like water. And this season, she decided to not borrow sawah again. So this is like near landless and rely on the labor farm labor. Okay, back to you, John.
So the point that Charina is also making is that the social reproduction squeeze on women is one of the things that's causing the stunting. And the government programs tend to overlook many of these quite complex problems, although they have great programs. I'm not rating on that, but it's these other problems need to be looked at as well. So in conclusion, how are we going for time? A whole 3 minutes. Okay. So look, there's 2 possible ways. We haven't actually, the next step in our process is to take all these ideas back and our survey results, which are just coming in, and take them back to the district and the provincial government, but first go to the communities and discuss with them, bring our results from all their discussions that we're kind of systematizing and ask them where they think the best options are. So that's where we're up to now. But I guess what we see then is that climate variability is part of a process, not on its own, that's leading to these cascading production failures, whether they be tree crops or rice production. And what we see is a response through intensification and migration, but these processes are also leading to this squeeze on life making and on nutrition. So the question is how to respond to this, and how can we use this idea of a nexus, of a agroforest livelihood, food and nutritional security and climate nexus, because all these things are interconnected. And this interconnection is represented here in the IPCC report. I've got this diagram from the IPCC report. So everyone represents this nexus in different ways. And we have our own diagram, which I haven't burned you with today because it's a little bit of a spaghetti, and I think it would be too difficult to explain. But the first option is to look at these cross-cutting issues and think about them using a whole of government approach. And this might be something like the World Bank. You might think about all these different points in the nexus and try and address them all simultaneously. The equivalent of sending in the 8th fleet, to use a bad example, trying to think of a very serious set of interventions and develop an integrated food security initiative to try and work on different parts of the nexus simultaneously. Now, this is a great idea. but whether we could get it to work is a serious question. I just came across an old ACR report about integrated development programs and about the challenges that they faced. The second option, and I borrow this picture from Burks and Ross, which I think is great. It actually shows in these communities there's all these different capacities, and when you spend time with them, you just see it on a day-to-day level. You see all the women going out together while the husbands are away. They do collective work on each other's gardens. They're all going to these church prayer groups, and around the church groups, they're mobilizing. So there's enormous capacity within these communities. Not to get overly romantic, but the second question is to try and build on these these kind of processes together with local government and church groups, and develop an incremental learning process, and investing in what the in University of Sussex, they've got this STEP Centre, this idea of transformative spaces to catalyse place-based solutions over time. Now, this is not a silver bullet, and it's clearly something that could be looked into. The question, though, like I think the other presentations were talking about scale, how do we get this kind of approach to work at scale? Do we need this sort of approach, or do we need to combine it with the more cross-government approach? And this is something we would like to talk about with Bapanas. I think there's a hope that there's a silver bullet for these problems, but with the Nexus idea, you can see there is no silver bullet. So the next step really is our option analysis, and we're trying to think about what the leverage points for both short-term programmatic changes, and I think there are many of those, we've got a long list, but more deep structural changes that are required to make the whole system more resilient. So this is my last slide. So we can see, in conclusion, when we study community strategies with dealing with their vulnerability, we can see three main pathways that have emerged from our work anyway. Firstly, supporting tree crop intensification, and this would involve trying to rejig the social forestry program to make it more context specific, that it actually works with Indigenous institutions and land tenure systems. The second approach would be responding to this nutritional transition and the depletion that Charina was talking about. And there's a lot of policy tools in the literature around how this might be done. And part of it will be addressing the vulnerabilities of women, which was in your presentation, which was really interesting. How can we address the vulnerabilities of women through post-harvest processing, assistance for women, maybe thinking about the social protection program, how it could be rejigged to help these women. And the third approach is thinking about migration. Because we think the Nexus approach, one of the main strategies is the migration pathway. So we shouldn't ignore this. How can we support these migration pathways, support remittance, reinvestment, and alternative enterprises? Okay, so this is the three pathways, and we think that these three pathways could be possible windows for interventions and in an integrated fashion. But that would be more in line with this approach. And the other question is, does Indonesia want to invest in a more integrated approach? Okay, so thanks everyone. Looking forward to your questions.
Terima kasih, Ibu. Terima kasih, Pak. Can we have one question for this last presentation before I open it up to all three presenters? Yes, please.
Great. I'm Jana Hurst. I'm the team leader for the Connexi Collaborative Research Program between Indonesia and Australia. Thanks, Pak John and Ibu Charina, for your presentation. I'm just interested in our discussions with Bapanas and the government of Indonesia, especially around community-based responses to climate change challenges. Oftentimes, they see it as a local issue. Oh, that's just in this community. Indonesia is a huge country. It's the fourth largest country in the world, 270 million people, 50 districts. So having results from one particular jurisdiction, they don't necessarily see the national relevance. But in the Connexi program, we're seeing and hearing the same kinds of results across the country in lots of communities across the country. So my question is, how do you get what can be seen as a localized issue to be an issue of national dialogue, and to take these community pathways that you're promoting seriously from a policy perspective?
Okay. We need to think about patterns in more than one place so that we can create over time a generative sort of story, and we can also understand the processes through which transformative pathways can emerge. One of the things is that there's an enormous amount of creativity at the local level and a lot of interest. What we found that there were these cross-sectoral working groups, both at the provincial and in both districts we're working, where different agencies work together and sit down together regularly to discuss these sorts of problems. And they wanted us to sit down with them, and we participated in a couple of their discussions. And so there's possibilities and I think Bapanas would be very supportive of that. So I guess we need to work with the governments at the local level to try and work out more generatively a set of tools for bringing these ideas forward.
So 4 fabulous presentations. And they really emphasize the importance of understanding where you're working and having that direct and active engagement with the communities on the ground. Hopefully Danian is still online and available to answer questions. So that's great. He focused very much on the importance of building resilience and understanding the differences across the different areas where their project was working. For Ellie's work with women, really working to make women's work visible and valued, but not forgetting men. As we're reminded in the US, everybody needs to be involved. And so having that discussion at the household level, making sure men and women are involved. And I also honestly believe that no man wants to see their child malnourished, but they're not often given the information they need or that opportunity to have that direct input. And from John and Charina's work, understanding that heterogeneity within a community is also very important, and that can take time to be able to understand those differences and different perspectives. So with that, yes, please. I love this. If you could introduce yourself and your affiliation, that would be great.
Thank you. My name is Sela. I'm from Papua, Indonesia. My question is for Mr. Danian Singh. In your presentation, I heard that you stated food security means access to healthy food. So I underlined the word healthy. In your research, did you also examine various of local food that can fulfill nutritional adequacy in terms of vitamins and other supporting nutrition? Because, for example, in Papua, I heard that there was a research stated that our main food, which is sagu, it's not enough for the supporting carbohydrate for our food. So that's why I'm asking you this. What is your recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Initially, that was one of our intentions when we tried to focus on this study, is specifically focusing on dietary. But then what we were recommended by both of the governments, that is Fiji as well as the Kiribati government, that there's already an intensive study that has been conducted a year before. So we did not focus particularly on nutrition or nutritional value. Initially, when I mentioned that definition, because that's the most commonly searched upon when we look at articles. But we looked at dietary patterns, and what we saw was that, and I mentioned it when I looked at key findings, was that there is a very heavy consumption that is taking place where we are now consuming a lot of processed food, store-bought food. We're shifting away from our traditional farming mechanisms in Pacific Island nations and focusing a lot on food that is more, according to these communities, conveniently available. to us. So I think we're heading towards, we're already in that place where we're not consuming a lot of healthy food, a lot of traditionally grown food, but we're focusing a lot on store-bought food. Yeah. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thanks, Danian. There was a question here. Yes, no. Yes, please.
Hello, presenters. My name is Charina. I work at the Policy Center and working on labor mobility, basically the Pacific labor mobility. I think all the presentations are very interesting. Actually give me a lot of new ideas thinking about the labor mobility. My question is, one on the Daniel's presentation, when he mentioned about this erosion of local language local knowledge is a bit hard for me to understand it. He mentioned that it's due to a lack of interest and gave the example of like preserving fish. In my opinion, like this is a very important skill, and I wonder what is the cause of the local people to really like kind of like start to lose this kind of interest in preserving the local knowledge in agriculture, and also on agriculture in terms of the solutions to address those challenges related to climate change resilience and others. I just wonder, like, is there any room in the Pacific Labor Mobility Program here in Australia to really address some of the challenges? Because one of the concerns in the program is that we kind of lack of skill transfer on agriculture, but is there, like, according to your research or your opinion, like, is there any room to embed that kind of components into the current program in Australia? And then out of personal interest, the Chinese foreign aid program, agriculture corporation, they have Jingtao like project that is really held in Chinese media as a super successful agriculture cooperation project, especially in Fiji, and it is promoted globally. And I wonder if you have come across that in your research, and what's your take on that?
Thank you. Please go ahead, Danian.
Thank you so much for that question. I think the first part is specifically addressed to me in terms of traditional knowledge. This is a very common thing in the Pacific Islands, but we see an erosion, or in many terms now, death of traditional knowledge that is taking place. Now, when we say this, and when I mention that there is a disinterest, that is specifically the youths that we have today that are not really taking initiative or participating in Indigenous activities in these communities. And when I say these communities, I mean Indigenous intact communities in the Pacific Islands. And that is due to a lot of reasons. And when we talk to elders in our community who are holders of this knowledge, they do say that whenever these activities do take place, we see very little youths participating. And because this knowledge is orally transmitted, that means it's passed from one individual to another verbally, it can only be passed to individuals, firstly, that remain within the community, and that will be able to carry that information forward. It will not be passed to somebody that will eventually migrate, and then when they migrate or move to an urban area, the knowledge is completely dead. Secondly, we see that this particular type of knowledge is not really included, for example, in our education system as we most wanted to. The education system itself is very heavily modernized. It focuses a lot on international aspects, which is important, but we may need to localize that down to really understand what happens at our community level or at grassroots levels. Another very important thing is that, like I mentioned, the word convenience. And we got to know that that word is very commonly used in interior communities of Kiribati, where, for example, previously fishing nets were made up of pandanus leaves. which were very commonly found. And it takes a lot of time to weave that particular net. And the netting pore size needs to be a specific size to capture a specific size of fish. But now, due to convenience and easily available nets that are available over the counter or in the marketplaces, it's easy to purchase that rather than spending a couple of weeks preparing at least 7 to 8 meters a pandanus net, for example. So we see that also taking place in communities. I mean, there are many more. And what we will eventually see is that a lot of this information, a lot of this knowledge is going to be lost unless until we document it and we present it in a much more modern way, which can easily be understood by our youths today. I hope I was able to answer the first question.
While people are thinking of questions just relating to the concept of erosion of knowledge, we have an erosion of languages. So we know about the biodiversity loss, but we're also losing languages. Here in Australia, we have lost hundreds of languages post-colonization. In Indonesia, we have 170 more or less local languages, with Bahasa as a unifying language. In Bangladesh, you have Bangla with a number of local languages. Across the Pacific, many, many local languages. And I wonder if partly as a community, a development community, whether we should be reflecting on the role we play in either allowing that knowledge, and the thing that comes with language is an understanding of the environment where it evolved, that diversity, that complexity, that when it all comes back to English, it sort of really gets lost in translation. English is a language of commerce. That's pretty much how it is. So that's just to fill in that space. Any additional, yes, please.
Thanks. Question for Ellie, I guess. I know World Vision's been testing and applying the inclusive market systems development approach in a number of countries. How do you see that approach perhaps needing to adapt, or how has it been adapting in this context of trying to also add in the climate resilience element? Have you made particular very deliberate changes in how that model is applied? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for the question. It's a great question. We definitely have been looking at changing the approach. We worked with I didn't go through it on the presentation, but we worked with the Canopy Lab on stock taking sort of sector good practice, and also updating our tools. I think the main thing is that just like the gender side of mainstreaming, you really want to look at how it fits into the overall IMSD approach. So the main focus that we've been looking at is how we update thinking about sector selection. Like, how do we weight opportunities for economic growth alongside pro-poor potential first, and then opportunities for women, and then thinking about opportunities for climate resilience and environmental sustainability. I think we can think about this in relation to climate risk, business models that support climate risk, business models that look at reducing the negative impact on value chains, and thinking about climate adaptation and mitigation. So thinking about updating key tools that our program teams use in this space. I think when we look at a lot of the market systems work, we looked at one value chain, and that's been the focus of the intervention. But when we look at selecting the intervention, we need to think about how that value chain sits with the diversified livelihoods in a particular farming community. And I think that's why World Vision has a lot of environmental approaches as well, linked to community-based natural resource management. And so when we're working on sort of new business models and selecting the sector, that's the really important piece. How do we think about win-win opportunities when we're thinking about new services and products for the poor. But then when we're looking at the complementary pieces like the gender inclusive financial literacy or social norm work, how can we think about how community-based land management practices or water management practices fit in relation to the commercial, the main value chain or business model you've selected on this side? So I think it's about thinking about those two levels again. What's the system level intervention? What are we doing at the household and community level? And thinking about it in relation to climate and environment. But I think starting from like, what's the problem in this context? I think it's all interrelated for families and households, farming families and households, and then figuring out what's the best intervention strategy here when thinking, interdisciplinary. Thanks.
Thanks so much for hanging on to 5:30. That's it's a long day for you, but is there a more important panel? Climate, food security and gender across Bangladesh, Indonesia and the Pacific. Thank you so much for all the work that you've put in, the work that you do. Thanks to our IT support for putting up with us. We're always there with last minute requests. Thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. These people are not rushing away if you have more questions. Thank you.